So welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with all of you. I'm Ethan Mollick. I'm a professor here at Wharton, and I study innovation entrepreneurship and also games. I've done some studies with Nancy Rothbard, who you may have also met at Wharton, on gamification, wrote a book on games and business. And I'm just thrilled to have this panel here. I think it's going to be really interesting and fun. I think part of what makes this such an interesting thing to talk about is that games are this really compelling, really interesting, and in many ways under-tapped resource for human resources and people analytics. Just to give you some of my favorite sort of game factoids here. Any of you ever played Angry Birds? So pretty universal, okay? So anyone not played Angry Birds? So, okay, so at the height of Angry Birds mania, right, which was like 2011, do you know how many person hours were spent a year playing Angry Birds? 11 billion. That's the equivalent of building a Panama Canal every day, okay? And that's just Angry Birds. So something about games is so compelling and interesting that 99% of teenage boys, 94% of teenage girls play games regularly. So if this is true, then this is a really compelling, interesting idea that we haven't necessarily touched on. And I'm really happy to have on this panel people who are thinking about games and people analytics and have distinguished records. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves very briefly, and then we'll get into the discussion. And obviously, if you have questions, I'm very interested in trying to get those to our audience as well. There's a lot to cover, and I think it's a really exciting topic. So I'll let you start off with introducing yourselves.
Hi, my name is Trisha Williams, and I am founder and chief creative officer of Pigeon Productions in San Diego and Tijuana. I also teach world building at the School of Cinematics at USC. I've been working in games for over a decade now. I literally went to video game graduate school. Yes, that exists. And I started in commercial game spaces doing AAA titles for Xbox, PlayStation, PC, and then the mobile boom hit and I went to mobile. I've taught games up in Seattle, and Pigeon Productions now we got a little tired of just making zombie shooters. So we moved out of that and are now providing fun and engaging video game front ends for scientists, for filmmakers, and actually entrepreneurs in education.
And I'm Pam Kato. I'm the owner of Pam Kato Consulting, and I'm looking for industry and academic partnerships in serious games. I just left my position at Coventry University, where I was professor of serious games and the director of the Serious Games Institute. And I was also the founding president and CEO of Hopelab, that's known for making the game Remission, which was a game for young children with cancer, which was shown in a clinical trial to improve their adherence to oral chemotherapy and also their prophylactic antibiotics over 3 months' time, a long-term behavior change that's related to improved survival in that population. And I believe in making great games, being very thoughtful, thinking deeply, like Malcolm Gladwell said yesterday. And yeah, and I'm starting to get into using games for analytics because I've been making games for education and training, and I've been asked to use those same games for analytics, and I thought, well, I didn't design them for that, but I'd like to do it the right way, so that's why I'm here.
Hey, great to be here. My name is Guy, and I started Knack. And I started Knack because a very prestigious hedge fund in New York turned me down for a job that I wanted. Turns out that it was actually a good move. I didn't control that, but it was a good move for me. And that's led me to start Knack. I'm not a technologist, so I'm not your typical startup founder. I didn't work for Facebook, Google, or others, and I have zero background in technology, but I learned along the way. I'm not a data scientist either, or a behavioral scientist, and you can kind of surmise by now that we leverage all those domains of knowledge. But I come from game theory, and that's what got me into games and thinking about signaling and what can we do to better understand and characterize the human operating system, the behavioral genome of people, and how they play and act and do and work and interact and engage and do all those wonderful things. That led to Knack, and 5 years later, we are in 120 countries and many Fortune 500s and many schools and universities and foundations and underserved populations far and beyond our imagination that have amazing talent, and the games help reach them, discover them, surface them, connect them with opportunity. So that's me.
Great. So there's a lot of things I want to talk to you guys about I think would be interesting. But let's actually start, before we talk about games for analytics, let's talk about games and analytics, right? So for a very long time, long before there was a People Analytics Conference, game companies have realized that their goal is to optimize player interactions with the game systems they build. So I was wondering, since you have some experience in the industry, starting with you, Trisha, maybe a little bit about how game companies think about measuring performance and people and what they've learned about how to maximize behavior and performance.
Sure. Yeah, this is my first analytics conference, but outside of the fact that nobody's dressed like a superhero, it's actually very similar to a game developers conference, is we love our data. We are constantly reviewing it all the time. Every click that you play in a game, we're measuring why you clicked, who clicked, when you logged on. Everything is collected and analyzed, and we go through it to make sure that we can improve our retention and we can improve our profit margin, our player base. And that's something, there's even companies out there that may have 1 to 3 data analysts per game designer that we have, because there's just so much data coming in. And so anyone out there that's actually interested in games, although I only saw like 2 people raise their hands and say Angry Birds, so gamers out there, we need people like you to be able to go in there and make games better.
And so, and you've taken this analytics piece and now extended it into sort of the gameplay piece. So what kind of things can you actually learn from how people play games?
Well, it turns out that we can learn incredibly amount of insights about people. So from their creativity to their emotional intelligence and empathy, to their leadership skills, to their grit, resilience, to how they learn, to how they think and interact with things. So it's just such a rich mechanism, such a rich machine to immerse a person in a really great environment, to modulate that environment, to measure different things, but not just kind of to throw everything into the kitchen sink, but to be very thoughtful about what we measure, how we then analyze the data, and how we then progress the experience in a very adaptive way to learn more about people. So, and to actually feed it back to them, so that it's actually empowering to them.
Okay, so there's one option of using games, which is games as sort of a data collection tool, right? Another thing about games that I don't think we've mentioned yet in 8 minutes in is the word fun, right? So what is it that fun brings to the table of people analytics? So is it just about having a front end that makes data collection more fun? Is there some other element to it that we can take away from it? What can we learn about fun?
Well, to me, so part of the fun in games is that it's a fantasy, which is kind of interesting because if you want to predict behaviors in the real world, you have this assumption you have to make everything really realistic and look just like the real world. But I mean, I found that when I put people in fantasy situations and get them to change their behaviors, they're more willing to fail, play around, explore, and then those behaviors generalize to the real world.
Could you maybe explain Remission, the game about childhood cancer to the audience? Yeah.
Okay, so what we found was that young people with cancer, especially teenagers, they weren't benefiting from the advances in chemotherapy. They weren't showing survival improvements, and part of the problem was their adherence to chemotherapy. That goes across disease types. And when you think about it, if you're a teenager with cancer, when you're given chemotherapy, they tell you you're going to live longer. You know, it's great for you, you need to take chemotherapy. But when they take it, they're like, okay, I take my medicine, and my hair falls out, I throw up all the time, my face blows up, I get diarrhea, really horrible constipation, I'm tired all the time, and I can't hang out with my friends because they make me sick, so I don't want to take the medication. So what we did was, they're very present focused, so we took them inside the body. You were Roxy and Nanobot, and this was mostly guys, and they actually picked the female Nanobot, so it was a fantasy situation. You went inside the body, and in the first mission, you went into a lymph node, and you saw all the cancer cells dividing. You had to get the patient to take the chemotherapy. You shot the cancer cells. You went to the next lymph node to fight the next set of cancer cells, and you might get a message saying, you have to go back, you left a few cancer cells there. Well, when you go back there, the whole cancer has come back. So you have this insight, and we didn't tell them directly, that I need my chemotherapy to kill the cancer cells. And if I don't get every last one of them, it will come back. So that's why, after 1 month of intense therapy, when I first get diagnosed, I still have to take my chemotherapy for 18 to 24 months, even when all the white blood levels look normal. Because if there's one left, the cancer can come back, and that really mimics real life. So it went from, I'm a good person if I take my medication, to I know exactly what's going on inside my body. It's an epic battle. I know what I need to fight it, and I'm going to fight it, and it empowered the kids. And it was related to their, them playing that game, whether they played the game for 30 minutes, just that level, or 20 hours of the game. 3 months later, they had higher levels of circulating chemotherapy metabolites in their body, which helps them fight their cancer.
So this idea of fantasy or abstraction seems to be important in games, right? You don't have to be playing a game where I run Google, Microsoft, or whatever to get benefit out of that or to see whether someone's good at this, right? It doesn't have to be literal. You're also doing some experiment. Your
Yeah,
product is very
absolutely.
non-literal, right?
So the fun is really an important and critical element to what we're doing, and designing for fun is important. And there are at least kind of 2 points I want to kind of point out to highlight here. One is that you get a more authentic observation of a person. So when we are doing something that we're fun and engaged, psychologists call that the state of flow. So the state of optimal experience, and there we are immersed, we're engaged, we are the true self. The true self comes to the surface. It's not our window dressing in an interview or in a test. So that's a very important thing. And you know, Walt Disney said that adults are just kids grown up. So we're all kids at heart in a way, right? And the games just gives us a way, an escapism, some vehicle to show that. But there is an even kind of more important stuff that's going on here. And that kind of ties back to diversity inclusion, things that Maxine was talking about earlier today. So there is research. I mean, stereotype threat is something that we all know about, right? And people actually, there are studies coming from Princeton, Eldar Shafir, to those who know him, about underserved kids, minority kids, may underperform their own ability in standardized tests because of all sorts of scarcity and mental load issues going on. And when you actually abstract from that and take people into a game and you release those tensions and you turn it into an abstraction, into a fantasy, into something that actually doesn't look like a test and is not a test, and you completely kind of reframe and change the paradigm, you're actually unlocking some really powerful dynamics here that have enormous societal benefits. So that's why we're excited about it.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth saying that non-abstracted games actually are dangerous in a way, because having something that's too much of a simulation of reality but isn't completely realistic can teach people the wrong things.
Right.
So abstracting stuff out has all of these sort of additional benefits. I was also involved in a study taking people from special forces units and putting them into a fantasy game setting, and we found that high performance among communications in those teams translated out to high performance communication in real life. So there's a lot of evidence, I think, that this approach works. So I guess there's a lot of companies here who have nothing to do with games, or maybe have done games for training, or maybe play games for fun. How should they think about this stuff? I mean, there's been a wave after wave of sort of games are interesting. So there was a games and training wave. Have you ever played Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego? Or any of those sort of. So if you played games in high school, you probably had experience with something that's called chocolate-covered broccoli. So you take something boring, like learning geography, and then we put something fun like games on it. But the games and the fun aren't really integrated, so you have chocolate-covered broccoli instead of an integrated dessert product, right? Broccoli covered with the chocolate of games. And so there was sort of a failure in games and education. Some training examples came out of it, and then we moved on to talking about serious games and games for health. And then there was a gamification movement. So there's been a lot of attempts to sort of bring games to the corporate world. Do you think it's taking off, and what are we sort of missing? What do we need to know to make games for analytics a big success for using game technology and ideas?
I actually think that a lot of people are approaching it that way with chocolate-covered broccoli, thinking that you have to trick people into doing something good with their game. And right now we're in an interesting situation because the gamers grew up. Games hit the living room back in early 80s. And they now have kids of their own, and they still like playing games. There's a huge percentage of gamers out there, especially actually women over 35 is this giant untapped potential. And something that we call guilt-free gaming it's similar to like serious games and gaming for good, but they want to play their games, but at the same time they're like, oh, I should go do this instead. I should do something productive. Give them something productive to do with their game. You can say, no, you're getting all the vitamins from your broccoli, and it's still fun. And being able to push the good of that forward for an untapped potential like that is going to make your products get out there and get the data that you need.
Other thoughts?
Well, I think that I have a bit of a different perspective than you do in terms of games for businesses, and it might be because I'm used to the European context, and especially when I was in the Netherlands and also in the UK, a lot of corporations and businesses use serious games for some of their change efforts and any kind of training that they need to do. So when I go to serious games companies, they're like, yeah, we'll work with you because we want to do a little bit of health, but we've got this whole business section and we got all these games that we're making for businesses. And the way that I saw it was that we always say, people think the word serious games is something new, but it actually came from the business management literature in the 1970s. And I think that businesses before education, before health, before all these other people had this realization like, oh, soft skills are really important. So you need to be able to talk to people, you need to be able to work on teams, you need to develop leadership skills and communicate well. And they figured out when they played games, even if it was simple role-playing games, that those help people play, relax, learn, and it would generalize to the real world. So I think there's a certain openness in the area of business, at least from my perspective from Europe.
So a quick observation here, just express a different kind of line of thinking. We don't call our games serious games because we think that serious games is an oxymoron. So games have to be fun, games have to be engaging, and engaging cannot be serious. If it's serious, it becomes actually tedious and kind of disengaging. So we talk about, those are games, those are fun games, those are mobile video games that are accessible to anyone. And kind of, I think some of the most powerful observations and experiences I had was with the Fortune 100 CEO who said, well, I'm not good in games, I don't like games. And then I handed him my mobile with one of our games, and the guy was just kind of sitting. I was happy to be a fly on the wall. The guy was sitting and playing, and to the point that his assistant came and said, you know, you're going to miss your flight if you don't kind of drop the game right now. So people kind of realize, I think, that games are the new currency. So, you know, 5 years ago, people thought that video on mobile is kind of a thing of the future, maybe far-fetched. Today, everyone watches video on mobile. Games are a currency. Games are a way that is a media that everyone is comfortable with. So there is nothing kind of, it's really just a question of, you know, I think the future is here, but it's not equally distributed. So it's just a question of when the rest are going to join the bandwagon.
Yeah, and so this idea of sort of specialness, or what makes these games kind of compelling, is something we keep kind of coming back to here, right? And there's, you know, I saw all the startups at that startup the startup convention. It was great, and congratulations to the winners. But the theme there was clearly machine learning. Let's get some large corpus of data, and then let's use machine learning on an outcome, and then, you know, that's analytics, right? That's the kind of result. And you can do that with games, right? Games have thousands of clicks happening. I can observe millions of variables over time, put people in complicated situations. So corpus building, you could definitely see, right? And I think I told you the story that there's a game, America's Army, which was an army recruiting game in the early 2000s. It took 0.25% of the US Army's recruiting budget, but it was the second most effective reason after patriotism of why people signed up for the Army. So very effective. But they were able to predict internally people's equivalent of the SAT score within 2 points based on 15 minutes of gameplay, right? So having a lot of data for analysis is one thing, but I think what's interesting when I talk to all of you is none of you are using sort of that just pure machine learning approach, right? There's some sort of thoughtful design going on. So,
Absolutely.
So what are the special things that games bring to the table other than just generating a lot of data? Like what do you, so you talked about being abstracted out. Are there other things that we're missing here that people need to know about so that we don't turn games unmagical by thinking about them in this context?
There's a lot of really fun emergent studies that come out of especially multiplayer games. It's a really good example in World of Warcraft. I'm sure you've probably heard of it, whether you played it or not. Back in, I think it was 2005 actually, called the Corrupted Blood event. It was a mistake. It was a bug in the code that had one of these bad guys that would poison one of the player characters, and it would tick down their health, and it was contagious. And it was supposed to stop, but it never stopped. And so the players were running around the world, and these were millions of players were running around this world passing this disease off to all the other player characters. And they were literally like these little dead player characters in these towns. And you would think, well, everybody's going to stop playing. It's broken. They didn't stop playing. They changed their social structure. They actually had healers go in and offer healing services. They had other people blocking off crowded towns saying, no, go that way. There's diseases over there. The CDC actually stepped in and went, oh my gosh, where's the data? We need this data. Tell me what happened, how fast the viruses were spreading, and how everybody responded. And it became this major 10-year study around that. And you couldn't have had that without that social interaction. If you had just designed data extraction from those things, you never would have ended up with that kind of study. So you have to remember that the fun and the fantasy of games can bring out fantastic studies that you wouldn't have even thought to approach.
And I just want to add to that, so one of the things I'm kind of interested in is there's a lot of work that's been done by certain people like Robert Mislevy and Valerie Shute at University of South Florida. They use this thing called evidence-centered design, and it's about how you can design games so that you can really kind of maximize the validation of what the components that you're putting in. And they're publishing a lot of papers about how you can incrementally design these games to check to make sure that when they're clicking in a certain way, it's a meaningful click. And when you're gathering that data, you're gathering the thing that you want to collect instead of, they're just sitting here tapping something, or you have something else in the area. So they're taking a very careful, structured approach to developing these games, which I think is very interesting.
Right. So I've got a question here that I'm going to modify slightly, but someone asked about whether there's behavioral differences how men and women play games, which the gender gap in games, and women and men play different kinds of games by and large. But I think in general, this raises a kind of interesting question, right? So games are very universal. They're played by people rich and poor. They're played by people in developing countries and in the United States. So this idea of whether games increase bias, remove bias, how we have to worry about bias, I think fits in nicely kind of the diversity questions we were asking earlier. So I know this is something that you've had a particular concern about.
Yeah.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about bias.
Absolutely.
And the kind of games you design.
So the reality, actually, to start from the real world, not from the gaming world, is that women and men differ on many different traits and attributes, right? So we know that women are smarter emotionally and socially, and that's probably a very good thing. So there are differences, and those differences carry over into the games. So you see patterns of different behaviors in the games. But to speak to the kind of a general point about bias and how do different gameplay micro-behaviors translate into uncovering people's potential and giving them feedback and direction. We've done extensive amount of work, and we continue to do that at our R&D kind of group about making sure that there is measuring to see first, is there bias on gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic, or age, and making sure that if we find the bias, that we apply machine learning techniques to extract, to factor out such bias. So in some cases, we did find some minor non-statistically significant bias, but we weren't happy with that even being there, so we took the extra step to remove that. But I think that kind of to flip it on its head, the gaming approach actually enables us to remove bias from many of the human interactions and the human decision-making that is going on in kind of business and education and the workforce. The language agnostic nature of the game, the fact that it's actually, we've validated that there is no bias, and the fact that it can actually counter the unconscious biases that are affecting and discriminating against people, that's actually an enormous opportunity to level the playing field and to look at people for their actual, what their potential is, not what I think or how I would rate them based on some idiosyncratic rater effect that they are not as good as I am because I think I'm great. So there are enormous benefits, we think, to that, but there is a big but. It takes lots of thoughtful and detailed work on the data science, on the R&D, on the science side, behavioral science, to make sure that this is actually the result that you're delivering. So now that we're taking gaming into the space of human potential and it really matters to people's life trajectories, I think it behooves kind of a higher level of responsibility of how we do and go about that.
And this idea of fantasy of being someone else other than you is also important, right? So it's not just the idea that we can have you play an abstract game that doesn't have gender or other kinds of biases, but I did a realistic business simulation game, and the top performers, people were allowed to choose their own identity. These were Wharton MBAs. The top performers consisted of a large percentage of them were women pretending to be men in the game. And they would actually change their communication style and experiment with different approaches as a result of being able to be someone other than who they were. So this idea of being able to play with other roles, there's a nice study by Tom Malone at MIT also showing, with IBM, showing leadership potential in games translates into leadership potential in real life. So there's a whole bunch of interesting things about this fantasy life overlaid over the real one that I think is interesting here. We unfortunately don't have that much time, and one of the things that keep coming up from all of your comments is about the thoughtfulness involved in building games, right? So one of the reasons why it's been hard for games to take on is this is not all science yet. There's art too, right? So one model is that you outline, let someone like Knack handle the problem for you, but you both have also built custom kind of games or work with people. If you're a company and you want to think about using games for teaching or games for analytics or evaluation, how do you start doing that? What do you need to know to even dip your fingers or feet or something in that space? Flippers, yeah.
For me, the first advice that I would give, so I think when you haven't done this before, the first thing people think is like, oh, you contact a developer. But before you do that, so a developer, if you come and say, like, I don't really know what I want to do, but I want to make a game and I want to do analytics and stuff, they'll be like, okay, and they'll start taking your money. So yeah. I'm sure none of the people here would do that, but they're a business, and of course they'll help you. But you also, as a company, and also if you're a content expert, you need to say first off what you want to do with the game. What do you want to measure? The more specific you can be, the better instructions and leads you can give to the developers, because they'll come and they'll complain to me, and then the developers feel like they have to go on the internet and do all the research and background, when actually that's something that you're supposed to do. So I would say, like, think about what you want to do first, define the problem you want to solve. Does this game have to be better than a current system you're doing to predict behaviors or to understand something? So what is your goal with this? And then go talk to a developer.
I second the be very careful when you talk to developers, because there are a lot of people out there that are, and none of them are evil, but it is a business. It's quick, and they get out small games and they put them out there and they keep going. One of the things that I think is generally a pretty good trait when you meet developers is they will try to give you some just basis of game design, because it is a study, it's an industry, and you really need to know what that is from the ground up. And just let them teach you, because that's what they're good at. The same way as if you're a scientist, if you're an educator, you have to teach them, like you said. So be open to learning about game design, and you guys can make it together.
My suggestion to people, and many companies have asked us, will Knack build a special game for us? And my quick answer is no, we won't do that, because first, it's going to cost you a lot, and second, it's not going to be as good as what we've already built. So there are network effects of data, and there is so much work and knowledge and IP that goes into, IP in the sense of deep expertise and know-how, that goes into building a game and refining and iterating with more data and so forth, that building a standalone game outside of kind of the dataverse or the ecosystem of this network of data that we're building just doesn't make much logic if you really want to get the best outcomes. So think about it just as any other product. You don't want to go and build your own Tesla. It's going to take you years, and it's going to cost you a lot, and the outcome is probably going to be far weaker. So why do that from the get-go?
Okay. And so we have a couple minutes left, but just that's pretty on the spot, but people will leave here, and hopefully they'll check out Knack, they'll check out Remission. You know, it's kind of sad that we can't do it on screen, because a lot of this has to be played to be experienced. Is there any recommendations you have of games that people should try that would either get them to sort of understand the basics of sort of what a good game is, or a game with a purpose of some sort? Any suggestions that you'd have that someone should download when they leave here, or at the end of our talk, or if the next panel is boring? It isn't. It's great. Any thoughts?
Yeah, go to the App Store, Android, iOS, type Bomba Blitz, and get the game. And then you're up to defending your tower and putting fires off and doing all sorts of other things, and using balloons, going back to your childhood.
And that's a Knack game. So
while
you're doing this, you're learning 400 things about me. All right. Okay, good. Any thoughts on things that?
Well, it's kind of funny, but the last game I played was Pokemon Go, and you know, I'm a psychologist. I'm a health psychologist. I want to improve health, and when I played that game, I thought, that was the game I didn't make. Yeah. And I'll tell you a story. So I was in a project. We were making a location-based game for health to increase activity among youth in Europe. And we said, and we had this decision: are we going to let them walk around the streets playing a game? And we said, no, they'll get hit by a car. We can't do it. So I was like, that's what happens when you get academia to do it. We're too careful. That's why you need to go with industry. He was like, I don't care. You know, you got the people walking through the streets, they get hit by a car, but they're out there getting exercise and they're having fun. So I love that game. Okay.
Excellent. And 20 seconds left. My recommendation, if you want something more lightweight, you can try, there's a whole bunch of games by a company called Mollick Industria that's actually critiques of capitalism, but in game form. They're kind of interesting to play. And if you like Game of Thrones, you should try the game Crusader Kings, where you run a family throughout medieval Europe. And it's really interesting because you're playing the game about the family, but you're actually learning a lot about all the ways medieval European economies worked and so on. But that's a little more time consuming. So I hope you get to play some of these things and download the Knack games, and I hope you'll consider this stuff in the future. We're at the very beginning. The companies that figure out how to do this and do this well are going to be hugely advantaged. I really believe that. This is a really exciting area. We're still on the edge of art and science, so I wish I could give you a packaged answer or something you should just download and you could build your own game. It doesn't work like that yet, but I think you could see some of the real potential here and how exciting it is. So thank you guys very much. Thanks to the panel.
Thank you.